mai. Lui ha capito. Ok, perfetto. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming also today at this session of the morning. So let's start quickly. Today we will have this discussion from Alessandra Gissi, who is professor of contemporary history at the University of Naples L'Orientale, and she specializes her research particularly in history of feminism, intellectual migration, and history of immigration. And then we will have the next speaker will be Sabrina Marchetti, who's professor in sociology, cultural process, and communication at the University of Ca' Foscari in Venice. And her research focused more on gender, ethnicity, labor migration, and a specific focus on paid domestic work and home care services. And then we will have Giulia Mancini, that holds a PhD in economics from Tor Vergata, and now she's working at the University of Sassari. She worked on the reconstruction of the female labor force participation in Italy, and also has various research on poverty, inequality, and gender. So, and after that, we will have the discussion from Juliana Freschi, who's PhD here in economic history in Sant'Anna. And so, yeah, the rules are like yesterday. We have 20 minutes for each presentation. Then we will have a discussion of Juliana of about 15, 20 minutes. And then we will take the questions from the audience or from online if there are any. So please, Alessandra, I leave the floor to you. And I'll let you know when you are like 5 minutes or something. Okay.
Thank you very much. So I will try to point out some key issues in the debate on wages on wages for housewives or domestic work. Of course, they are not synonymous. I will be schematic. I'm sorry for that, but there's no other way. I start from 1976 in a very brief but fundamental paper that appeared in History Workshop. Two historians, Sally Alexander and Anna Davin, wrote, and I quote, "The working classes generally meant working men. Women are the wives, mothers, and daughters of working men. Domestic life is treated as a static, unchanging backcloth to the world of real historical activity. Unpaid domestic labor is absent." That's true. Unpaid domestic work has always been the least visible. Is something like a kind of non-existent work. It's a work that does not exist, even if it has been carried out, represented in a way, and also named. Nevertheless, the history of unpaid domestic work concern major political and economic transformations, but also cultural norms and the relationship between genders and their constructions. Even more importantly, it concerned the process of defining the concept of citizenship in the 20th century and the difficult balance between equality and difference. Nowadays, thanks to the discourse on women and gender history, which has drastically changed the historiographical landscape, we could consider it as this belonging to the past. However, housewives' wages is still a neglected topic. It has received very little consideration by scholars, especially Italian ones. Of course, this is a missed opportunity, because if we place housewives' wages in an historical perspective, we see how the story of the debate is much longer than the explosion during the 70s. In addition, it's easy to see how many crucial issues converge: the division of labor, the redefinition of men's and women's different natural skills, the essential role of women at home, the public and private spheres, and the relationship between generations. Also, the model of welfare and the redistribution of profit, the monetary value of housework to the family, and the estimated contribution to the gross national product. First of all, it's interesting to ask why this reticence about this issue. It has an undeniable complexity, and it also very ambiguous topic. Because progressive and conservative arguments are constantly mixed. I can do an example. The sociologist Anne Oakley, for example, using qualitative interviews with housewives in southeastern England, reached the conclusion that support for housewife wages has always conservative ends, even when it comes from a progressive background. Another very good example for this ambiguity is the Weimarian Germany. I will be very short about it, but it's very interesting. The campaign for household rationalization, which was borrowed from the United States in the 20s, was aimed primarily at working class women, and industrialists, bourgeois, feminist, and social democratic trade union leaders were three of the most enthusiastic promoters of the household rationalization, but all of them had different and frequently contradictory political agendas. In Italy, the debate on housewives' wages is also marked by a karst trend, and very often it contradicts, the opinion contradict themselves. Of course, we are very used to put this debate in the 70s of the 20th century. However, it aims to trace the origins of the proposal for housewives' wages starting from the 30s. There was a fascist theorization, very far from feminism, linked housewives' wages to the enhancement and scientific organization of domestic work. This is the context in which the first proposal of wages for housewives appeared. In the mid-20s, in Italy, had a huge centrality of pronatal policy. I will not explain because I'm very sure that you know perfectly what I'm talking about. Just look at the housework, at the homes, and fascism sought for young brides a strict apprenticeship of household management, the so-called economia domestica, household accounts, control of consumption, computation of nutritional value of foods, clean, beautiful homes. During the early 30s, fascism began to deal with housewives with a precise political agenda in mind to consolidate the sexual hierarchy within the family and make the most of the resources of domestic work. This is the frame for an immersion of the work of housewives as coming from the private sphere to a social recognition, even as a regular employment. There were variously discussed and never realized projects to grant a salary to housewives, fell within the scope of propagandistic measures put in place to acknowledge the economic importance of domestic work. Just to give an information, in the census of 1931, half of the Italian working age female population figure as housewives. But of course, they had a socially heterogeneous profile. The housewives model developed by fascism had, however, a precise reference in women belonging to the urban middle classes, especially those of white-collar standing, while peasant women were presented with a model of domesticity quite different from the urban one. The role of these housewives was to consolidate a new form of patriarchy based on an economically weak male figure that often conflicted with the masculine image of the regime. The good housewives was the one who respected the asymmetry of gender roles within the family and guaranteed the well-being of her husband and children with her management of family resources. Her role was also to provide the family with the respectability that distinguished the middle classes from workers and peasants. The discourse on housewives and domestic work reflected all the ambiguities that characterized fascist policies concerning women. If, on the one hand, the housewife was asked to reproduce traditional forms of subordination, she was in the same time used on the other to modernize household tasks, thereby changing lifestyle and family relationship. This meant to build up a new housekeeping roles. Just to say a few things, the Ente Nazionale Italiano per l'Organizzazione Scientifica del Lavoro, cioè l'ENIOS, non traduco in inglese, founded in 1926, began publishing a bi-monthly magazine called Casa e Lavoro, Home and Work. And this magazine started in 1929. It was a periodical devoted to household management guidelines, family training, nutrition, decoration, and hygiene. The introduction in Italy of domestic economy as scientific discipline based on the organization of labor as applied to the household was made possible by the work of Maria Diez-Gasca. I will not tell more. She translated the American manuals about the organization of the tailoristic organization of housekeeping. And these manuals circulated quite a lot. In 1927 was the new housekeeping was translated into Italian. And in 1913, the magazine Casa e Lavoro published Il meccanismo della casa, which was a partial translation of Household Engineering, written by Christine Frederick in the US. In this text, the house is conceived as a workplace where the woman acts as a worker and at the same time is her own manager. Moreover, in the logic of production, an efficient use of time is closely linked to money. I go on about this. The ideal housewife was not only a wise administrator of the family budget, but also a responsible consumer. Members of the regime, engineers and architects theorized the scientific way to think about the house, to take care of the house, with the idea of the transformation of the masses into a broad middle class. I go very fast. After the Second World War, the consequence of equality, of equal social dignity for women in the new Republican state is written in the second part of the Article 3 of the Constitution, promulgated in 1948. But as the historian Anna Rossidoria wrote, the brand new Constitution does not accept the assertion of the individual rights of women within the family. In fact, reestablishes the inferiority of them in the so-called private sphere. Just have a look, just consider the Article 37 very briefly, which is related to the individual rights of women, the relationship between work and family. And as you can read very clearly, working women have the same rights and are entitled to equal pay for equal work. Working condition must allow women to fulfill their essential role in the family and ensure special appropriate protection for the mother and child. In sum, working women have the same rights and are entitled to equal pay for equal work, but their working condition must allow them to fulfill this essential role. The adjective essential attached to women's role in the family very clearly explain and suggest both a necessity and a predetermination. This formulation is the result of a compromise between Catholic and conservative forces and the leftist in the Costituente. Now I can't tell you more, question of time. But it also reflects the ambivalence inside the labor movement itself. During the 50s, the issue of domestic wages was never explicitly recovered. Also because it had a fascist frame around. More moderate proposals were advanced, which had less ideological and financial impact. In the 1955, just for example, the communist and the socialist female members of parliament wrote a bill focused on voluntary subscription of insurance that would favor all women over 55 years, but nobody never talked about wages for housework anymore. Until the 70s arrive, and I will conclude very soon. I just want to remember how in the 8th March of 1972, that was the first 8th March of the neo-feminism, the new feminism. There was a leaflet turning from hand to hand, and the very first sentence of this leaflet was, "The woman is still a slave, 90 or 40 hours a week of unpaid work at home, and the woman is still a housewife." Now, from the very beginning of the 70s, start in a way a new life for the debate for housewives wages. which is very complicated to tell in few words. I just want to, of course, remember Lotta Femminista per il Salario, which started in Padua and had very strong relation with international feminism and Black feminism in the US. They started from the assumption that in the Fordist factory, the workplace was physically determined and was based on specific relation of production and power. Feminists saw that this model as a paradigm could be exported from the class struggle within the domestic space on the ground of social reproduction. This means to go back to Marx. It's a radical rethinking of social organization. But just two things to conclude. The first one is how this debate was never considered as an object of a deeper sight, a deeper look by the historians. And the other one, which is quite that was interesting to me, is how the feminist debate completely forgot or pretend to forgot the fascist debate about household, the role of household work and the idea of wages, which of course it's quite interesting to look at. I think it's enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Also perfectly in time. Okay, so now I give the floor to Sabrina Marquette. Yeah, perfect. Okay, you can change the slides.
So, good morning, everybody. Thanks again for this wonderful invitation, and congratulations to the very nice group that is organizing this. And the discussion of yesterday was very inspiring for me, so I've tried to adapt a bit to something that has been said yesterday, but we already agreed, as you will see with Alessandra, that basically I follow on her. So she is finishing around the 70s, and I will kind of continue on what is, let's call it the parable or the spectrum of something else. I mean, it's another perspective. Mine will take a different angle, but still as a periodization, I will continue to the 90s until the 2010. So very much until today. My own take on that is, as it is in the title, so when we pay for care, what do we pay? How these payments, the fact of paying for care has changed through time. I'm not an historian, so as I also clarify in the title, I'm taking a more of a sociological, we could say, perspective on the historical changes, let's say. So the very large process will be how care has been transformed from unpaid vocational, so to say, activity that was carried out mostly by women in the private households into something that is paid labor and commodity on the market. The reference for that is an article that I wrote some years ago with Sarah Farris on the commodification and corporatization of care. So in the slides, as you will see, I did not put a lot of references. You may go to the full article to find more details, more information. In this moment, Sarah and myself are reworking on this article in order to expand more on migration issues. So, I mean, when I got this invitation, I was actually reworking on this article, so perfect timing, I would say. In this discussion, some of the historians on domestic work are looking back in time to identify the moment in which the work that was done by servants in the homes before was not paid in monetary terms. So when we can start to think about a monetization of the domestic work, when I say domestic work, let me clarify, I'm thinking about caring for physically attending the care of elderly children, especially elderly people more for today, cooking, cleaning. So the work that is done by nannies and domestic workers in the private homes, all kind of work. And historians like Dirk Earle, for example, they say that until the 17th century, the work of servants in the homes, I mean, this work was done by servants typically, was not paid in monetary terms. So they got more accommodation, food, and other type of provisions. But during the moment in which slaves had to be sold on the market, in the slave market, that was the moment in which the owners of the slaves had to figure out how much that valued, how much every different slave what will be the right price of every different slave, depending on the capacities that they had for the kind of work they could perform. So that was not only assessing the cost, so to say, of the slave as a person, but also what he or she was able to do in the private homes. As you know, slaves were different type of task, and they were the so-called domestic slaves who work in the homes. Raffaele Asarti is also saying that in Italy, in Europe, more in general, we see in the 19th century how these type of jobs started to be paid instead of being, accommodated in other ways. The 90s, the scholarship on welfare states and commodification of care work very much agrees on the fact that the 90s have been a very hot decades when speaking about commodification of domestic work. In particular, Claire Hungerson, in this very famous article of 97, so already like in the middle of the 90s, she's already saying that the 90s are very important for two different type of reasons. The first reason is that the 90s are at the end point, so at the end of a process that was intensified during the 70s and 80s, so therefore in the 90s is at the final end of the transition that was composed by these three forces. One will be, very much in connection to what Alessandra just said, the result of feminist claims that claim not only that it should not be unpaid as a work, but also there was not a commitment for every woman in their homes. Also, the feminist movement, as a side effect, also produced what has been called the delegation of care and domestic work to other women, or women who used to do that would claim a salary for that. So these processes of seeing even more domestic work as something that had a price attached to it. Another movement, maybe not so present in Italy or in Europe, but very much in the United States, were social movements led by interest groups of disabled people or chronically ill people that started to wanted to have more voice on the type of care that they received. We should think that just before that, the tradition was of social work provided by the state, in which disabled and chronically ill people were taken in charge by the state, but with very little autonomy, very little space for decision on what type of care they received. And we also know from the movements in the 70s on the psychoanalytic critical movement on how care and the medical care that you received was started to be put under question. Another movement is, of course, something that I think we can something that has been said yesterday by Francesca Bettillo. So the question of autonomy and freedom of choices in the care that you receive. people perceiving themselves as more of a free chooser, someone that can decide by him or herself the best solution in the market, not something that is imposed by others. Of course, when I just wanted to make a very general disclaimer that when we speak about these stories about welfare states and for what I'm concerned, commodification of care work, there might be a very strong risk of what I'm calling here welfare Eurocentrism. Thinking that what we are describing now in this moment has been valid or is valid for welfare states or care provision all around the world. This would not be the case. Will not be the case in many countries, will not be the case outside of Europe, will not be the case within Europe, and especially within some countries, let's say Italy, which is very divided and had different stories about care provision by the state, will not be just the same. For some, we tend to always to think, I mean, I have a lot of problem when I hear people saying the crisis of the welfare state. There has been with, I don't know, austerity or welfare reforms that testify the crisis of welfare state. This, of course, is departing from the assumption that care had been previously, before the crisis, assigned to the state. So there would be a transition from the family to the state, and then a process that, as I like here, is called of refamiliarization. So going from the family to the state and from the state back to the family, or remotherization. For some, and then the market entered in the moment in which the care was coming back to the family, so it was refamiliarized. In many other contexts, the market did enter in the family, in this streamline from family to market. There was not this triangle going to the state. And this is something that we should keep very much in mind, especially when we think of Italy, for example. At this point, again, in the 90s, as I said before, the 90s is a very hot decade, not only because it is at the end of this process through the 70s, processes happening through the 70s and 80s, but also because it's the beginning of other processes that are called of marketisation. Marketisation is an ambiguous phenomenon. The definition that I'm using is this one. So marketisation is something that is promoted by the state in the way the state authorize, support, or enforce the introduction of markets. The creation of a relationship between buyers and sellers makes this possible, and the use of markets to allocate care. So the marketization is not simply the entering of the market in the care, commodification of care, but it's the way the state is promoting the entering of this market. And in this process, the introduction of cash for care is also happening mainly during the 90s or early 2000s in several parts of Europe. And we all know what is cash for care, for example, meaning that the fact that the state is not providing any more in-kind type of care, but is providing monetary resources with which people can buy what they want. Examples of these through the 90s and the early 2000s of policy reforms, such as in 2006, the Child Care Act. So in the UK, in which it's decided that private care providers should be prioritized over other providers. In Sweden, already in 1991, a new local government act that care can be outsourced to private actors. In Italy, very much early in the 1980s, law number 18 on what is called in Italian indennità di accompagnamento, that, as you may know, is giving cash allowances with which people can just purchase the kind of care that they want. I don't have time maybe here to go through all the data, but as you can see, there is a steep rise on the privatization of services. As you can see, many of them are in relation to elderly care, but also childcare, nurseries. We got to the point of, in 2005, for example, 40% of childcare is provided by private actors in Italy. 70% of places in care homes is privately run in France in 2008. Here again, you can see the article for references and more data. In 2010 happens a further progression of this sort of evolution. That is what Sarah and myself are calling corporatization. The corporatization kind of provision of care and purchase of care, the market is entering even more massively. It's entering in a way in which it's becoming, as I wrote, a key operator that is changing the way in which care is provided. So the type of care which is sold and purchased in this market is in some ways just not just as it used to be before. So there is a transformation on the way we conceptualize care. Other examples here, the healthcare sector after the 2007-2011 crisis is one of the few sectors that has been growing instead of losing ground. I did not put it here, but in Australia, for example, we have also in the UK, I think today we have some companies providing care providers that are in the stock market. One of the probably most well-known example is the reform of the Health and Social Care with the Health and Social Care Act in 2012, thanks to which large companies, an example of them is Virgin, the same of the airplane flight companies, and Virgin Music, just the same company, is today one of the largest providers of care provided by the NHS. Here you can see other data, Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, 99.5% of child care for children is privatized. In Italy, there is this, one of the largest companies, this private assistenza with, as you can see, large revenues. What we see here when we speak about care is also going back to something that has been said yesterday, how this care is framed. It's a care which is framed as affordable in price. So is this kind of business model which is proposed is a care in which a win-win situation in which the care receivers or the family of the care receiver would get affordable care, but very high quality care. So the definition of the task, the type of care which is provided is usually listed in a sort of catalog. So if there is some, I don't know, I'm thinking about again Lorenzo's presentation yesterday. I mean, this messiness around what is care is actually very much clarified by these companies that they can list in very much detail what they provided, what do they define as a care as a business meant as something working well, something efficient, something that you can see also in the phrasing, the solutions for care. So when you are coping with a very big problem, if people don't know how to handle the sudden care needs in their homes, they will be the market helping you just your way through. Combining these efficiency, these, this project kind of dimension of what is the care that you need, with also sweetness, tenderness, this coziness that is conveyed by this type of images and the type of advertisement that they do in the narrative with which they describe the services that they provide. So it's a pick and choose in the hands of the customers, as they're called. And this is, of course, along the lines of what I mentioned before, this movement starting already from the 70s and 80s, in which people, instead of being perceive themselves as a patient, as someone in need, they perceive themselves as something that is actually doing the best choice for herself or himself. So also a very important kind of process in turning upside down yourself as a dependent person into yourself to be the one who's able, you or your family members, as being the ones who are able to do the best decisions for you. Of course, it's a very individualistic process. It's a very family-based. So it's a very, again, to fall back on something that I said yesterday, it's a pretty claustrophobic relationship between you, your family, your household, and the company. It's not done in a way in which you enter in a relationship with, the community or the neighbors, etc. Another way to see it, and this is a very important part of this story for me, is the way in which the services which are provided are unpacked in a list of very detailed tasks and very subtasks, so to say. The caregivers, the workers, at the end of every day, they have to fill this kind of forms in which they say every detailed, specific gesture that they made. For example, in personal care, did they give a bath? Did they give oral hygiene? Did they comb the hair? Did they help in dressing? Did they help to shave? Did they help with skincare? Did they help to do the nails? Did they help to care for the feet? Food care. That goes on, nutrition, activities that you did, room exercise, go for a walk, etc., etc., etc. As you can see, this is often done with app, so through a tablet or a smartphone that the workers have. They can tick on what they've done, and to every one of these tasks is associated an already decided amount of minutes that the workers needs in order to perform. So if it is a bath, will be maybe 15 minutes. If it is a nailing, will be 5 minutes. And the worker is going to be paid only for the time that was decided by the management before. If bathing is going to take longer because, I don't know, there is any kind of issue, so that instead of 15 minutes, you need 20 minutes, these extra 5 minutes are not paid. So as you can see here again, there is not much confusion of what is care. There is a very exact, very precise, very detailed articulation of what is this care is about, how much it costs, how much is going to be provided by the family, by the company. In some cases, this is important. We talk with Francesca Scrinzi, we try to work on the notion of bureaucratized care. So when care needs to be provided by the public authorities, some of these people are going to be refunded by the local municipality, for example, for the care that they need, and the local municipality will pay only for the specific amounts of time. So very often these processes of bureaucratization are not only the result of market process by the side of the companies, but are also effect of the public administration that because of the way public administrations today manage their budgets, are also implementing company-like or efficiency type of organization of their work. So, I mean, it's not that only the company is the one imposing this type of work organization, and therefore the conclusion will be using the notion of corporatization of care, interrogate us about the ways in which for-profit actors are entering the world of care, are imposing what we could say business rationalities in the organizing principles, but also corporate logics of profit making from the side of the companies. And this is also, I mean, for me, this is the important part of the way in which this is also changing the way we do imagine, we do think about care, what the care that we receive, the care that we give, and much in our family, personal relationship, this idea on the way we provide care is also entering in not paid forms of care. How much we can count the time that we spend with the people we love, how much we can incorporate expectations on how that should be done. So from the perfect housekeeper that should clean the house in the rational perfect housekeeper model of the handbooks that Alessandra described into this type of comparing your spontaneous kind of attitude with care, with expectations, how that should be performed.
Thank you very much. So now I'll leave the floor to Giulia Mancini. I need yeah, 1 second to set the slides. Okay. Sì. 1 second. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so thanks, and I I just want to thank the organizers again and thank you for being here today. It's a very interesting session, I think, and I'm sorry to have missed yesterday, unfortunately. So as you can see from the title there, after these much more comprehensive accounts of the historical evolution of care work, I'm going to take a much narrower view of it in a way. The title is a title of a paper of mine that just came out, which is focused, as you can see, on rural Italy in the 30s. But I just wanted to basically convince you that the lurking in the background of this much more focused study are still the large questions that we have just heard mentioned in the previous talks. So I'm thinking about these long-standing debates in women's economic history. I'm just going to summarize them very, very crudely, but I see mostly three big topics that I was interested in before starting this work that I'm gonna explain to you today. So one big topic is this idea that women have always worked, right? So this is a discussion that has been going on for decades in women's economic history, and it's the idea of challenging this notion that women's work is a modern phenomenon, that it's something that has, that we have witnessed in the recent past decades after World War II, and before then, women were relegated to a domestic sphere, and the historical evidence just disputes that. And there are many examples of women's work, many, in the pre-industrial epoch, and many examples of this work being important for the household's income. And so women have always worked, in fact. Another big topic or big debate is that of the sexual division of labor, of course, which we have heard about in much at length. So this fact that with remarkable regularity across cultures and over time, women have been the ones to bear the major responsibility of care work, of unpaid domestic labor, of non-market work. There are many definitions and names for this kinds of activities, each of them subtly different, but in general, there is this specialization in care work for women and the consequent economic marginalization of this type of work, which of course is unpaid when it is performed as own production within the family. And the big overarching theme, I guess, the biggest question of all is the concept of work itself, right? The first two topics both focus on the idea of work, but in a way, when we talk about women having always worked, we usually focus on market work, right? Or on the standard definition of work. Whereas when we think about the sexual division of labor, we want to be broader in our definition of what is work and include all of those activities that are productive but are not paid or are not exchanged on the market. And this dualism, of course, is very important. So the objectives of this paper, of this work, are, well, first of all, the focus is very much on measurement, on quantification. And the idea is to use a sort of peculiar source. It's a very well-known source, actually, in Italian economic history, but it has still a lot to say about women's work, I guess, which is family monographs. And I'm going to explain in a second what they are. Especially monographs that were collected in interwar Italy, in the agricultural sector, rural families, as an alternative source of data on women's work to tackle specifically two questions. One is the measurement of female employment, standard definition. So the measurement of employment across time, over time. And what is by now pretty much accepted is the fact that the sources that we usually can count on for historical reconstruction of employment are very problematic when it comes to measuring women's employment. And I'm thinking specifically about population censuses, which are one of the major sources for historical reconstructions of employment. Not the only one, but for Italy, for example, is the most important one. So we know they are wrong. They underestimate female work, especially in agriculture. So the idea is by how much? If you go to an alternative source, can we get an estimate of the underestimation? The other question is, what can we learn from alternative additional measures of women's work that are a bit more nuanced, a bit richer than a simple indicator such as the employment rate or female labor force participation. So this source allows us to go beyond female labor force participation and trying to measure other aspects of women's work, including the allocation of time between market work and non-market work or care work. Just a short aside on what family monographs are. Some of you might already know, but the tradition goes back to French social scientist Frédéric Leplé, and these are detailed, almost ethnographic accounts of the living conditions of the lives, of the biographies almost of individual families, which are interviewed at length about their daily lives and their past and what they do with their time, how much they earn, and so on. The tradition is well established, goes back to the collections of monographs by Leplé in the mid-19th century. But Leplé had a lot of followers throughout Europe, and in Italy, his approach inspired several large-scale inquiries, starting from the end of the 19th century all the way through the 1930s. The focus, as I said, is on a specific decade, so early 1930s, and on rural families. In that period of time, there was this pretty extensive collection of family monographs that was spearheaded mostly by the Istituto Nazionale di Economia Agraria, which was founded in 1928. And not only that, though, so there was a lot of work on the side, or basically satellite authors that were also collecting family monographs in the same period. And the idea here is that the monographs have very clear advantages when it comes to studying women's work, because they are uniquely detailed. They contain information that is simply not there in many other sources that we have for pre-industrial times. For example, a clear list of tasks of how hours worked, daily activities of all family members, not just men, but women and children as well. They also have very clear disadvantages, of course. One of them that is very important for a quantitative study is the fact that this is not a statistical sample. So monographs were not collected through random sampling from a population. That was not the idea. The idea was very much, let's try to find some representative ideal types of a population, and let's go in depth, sort of almost like a case study, even though case study is the wrong word for it, but just for an intuition. So representativeness is a problem. Sample size is a problem because there's few of them. And then ideology is a problem. We are in the 30s, and the previous talks have, introduced some of the ideology of the fascist regime on both rural households and the role of women in rural households. So these interviews are not neutral ideologically, right? So we have to be careful about all of these things. This is just, as to give you a visual of this type of source. Again, for those of you who might not have seen them before. So what we usually have is a few pages on each family, where we typically we sometimes have a picture, we have the composition of the family, demographic characteristics, and a lot of qualitative information about as I said, the biography of the family or the history of the family. What they do with their day. So there's usually a textual description of activities, daily lives, and so on. Traditions, there's really a lot of interesting things. It's a bit like traveling back in time, but and then there's a lot of quantitative information as well that is very standardized in these monographs. So here, what you see is like a table of hours worked, of days worked during the year, divided by type of activity by all members of the household. It's not always there, but often. And then what you have here, it's kind of small, but it's a detailed balance sheet for the family. So you have the consumption, income, and wealth, item by item, for these families. So there's really a lot of detail, a lot of precious information. All right, so this is just an overview of the collection of monographs for the 30s, just to give you an idea of how they are distributed geographically and the numbers that we're talking about. So it's about 110 households, about 800 individuals. They're pretty well distributed throughout the country, but of course there are issues of overrepresentation of certain areas, especially Tuscany, or underrepresentation of others. So we are spotty in the south. We don't see it from the graph, but there's also an overrepresentation of certain land tenure types. So sharecroppers are overrepresented with respect to other types of agricultural workers or families. The period is the early 30s, more or less. So as I said, most of it comes from the Monografie di Famiglie Agricole, and then it has been supplemented by other comparable monographs. So what I do to sort of remedy, at least partially, this representativeness issue is to stratify the sample, post-stratify the sample. So I just define 6 strata based on geography and type of land tenure, basically, and construct expansion factors to recalibrate the composition of the collection to something that is more similar to the true composition of the population, because I'm after something that is close to nationally representative, at least for agriculture. Right, so to go to the first question, by how much does the census get female employment wrong? So just to remind, as a reminder, for this, the focus is on the standard definition of work, so market employment, which just, it's the standard ILO definition of employment, any activity that produces goods and services that are to be exchanged on the market for pay or for profit. So I'm just going to show you a comparison between census estimates and monograph-based estimates for 1931. Before showing you the graph, I'm going to show you the legend of the graph, because it's we have several numbers to compare. The black will be the microdata, so the monographs. The blue will be the census. It's not only one estimate, because we have the so to speak, raw census estimates, so those who were published and that are available as summary tables. And then we already have actually an adjustment to try to make up for the underestimation of female employment in agriculture. So the fact that the census was not precise in recording female work was already apparent to contemporaries, and the work of Ornello Vitali in the 60s tried to make up for that by supplying an alternative inflated estimate of female work based on reasonable assumptions. So not on any data, alternative data, but on a series of educated guesses that provided an inflation factor for female employment in agriculture. So we already have better estimates of female work from the census. And this is the graph. So you have women on the left and men on the right with the comparisons of the three estimates. So as you can see, for men, there really is no difference if we look at census estimates and if we look at the monographs. For women, the story is very different. So the census estimates, the raw ones, the light blue is of course really low, as expected or as noticed already. The inflation, the adjustment that was already available from Vitali is at about 50% in agriculture, and the monographs scale up this number by even more. So they add a further 30 percentage points, going up to about an 80% employment rate in agriculture. So it's a kind of a weird employment rate, but it's focused on agriculture in order to facilitate comparisons. So this is by how much, at least in this moment in time, the census was getting things wrong in measuring female employment in agriculture. The second question to tackle with this source is what happens if we go beyond standard measures of female work? As I quickly showed you before, the data in the monographs allow us to come up with an estimate of time spent in two major types of activity: commodified work, market work, and the terminology that is in the paper calls it reciprocal work, but it's non-market work or own production, basically, for the home of either goods or services. The allocation of activities in these two types of work is not super clean, meaning that the source does not all the time distinguish between what is market and what is not. It's not, such a relevant distinction, but we can try to do the best we can to put the hours worked in these two bins and estimate work intensity for these two categories and for men and women separately by gender. I'm going to skip over this. This is just technicalities. I was going to explain to you the type of adjustments that I tried to make to exactly or as accurately as possible allocate hours in market and non-market. But if if we want to talk more about that, I will go back to that. I just wanted to show you the results on hours worked. So here we have market and reciprocal work for men and women. These are averages in the data, in the collection of data. We can look at the gender ratios here, which are simply the ratio between female hours and male hours in each category. And it is very apparent that a polarization of roles is very extreme here. So women do less than half as much work in the commodified category as men, and they do as much as 14 times more work in the reciprocal category as men. This is a sort of further step that I tried to take, a further conclusion that I was trying to get from the data in terms of the impact of this polarization of work and of tasks between paid and unpaid. So I was trying to come up with estimates of women's share of total household income, monetary income, which requires some assumptions. So it ends up being a bit of a guess, because so many of the households in the data and in the rural sector overall are own account workers. They're self-employed, so they don't really have a wage that can be attributed to individuals. So we don't really know how much everybody earns from their market labor. We know a total for the household, and we have to decide how to allocate it to each person depending on their labor input, right? So we need a few assumptions on this. Not really gonna go into the details. Depending on the assumption, how conservative they are, we can come up with estimates of the female share of the household's monetary income, or what they could claim of the total income that was coming into the household. It goes from 40% to 20%, more or less. But the idea is that the polarization of work between paid and unpaid tasks would probably generate an unequal claim to total household incomes, with the potential repercussions on bargaining power within the household, for example. So to recap, regarding the all women worked, yes, it seems that almost all women worked, 80% in this particular context. And they did so throughout the life cycle. This is something that I have not shown today, but there's evidence that all types of women worked, all ages, and so on. However, once we go to time worked, to work intensity, there's still a very strong polarization of productive roles. This is just another way to see the same results. 30% of total market work was performed by women in terms of hours, and up to 90% of the reciprocal work was performed by women as total hours supplied by the household. So in a way, having these more detailed statistics can help reconcile somewhat contrasting narratives from the literature. So in a way, every woman was working, but still women's work was marginalized and undervalued. I just wanted to conclude on a few, again, going from the specific to the broad, with a few implications of this type of research. What this kind of analysis of micro sources could potentially contribute in terms of broader debates. And I see two directions. So one is in a way outwards, meaning outside of the household. And I'm thinking of the work of Carmen Sarasua, who works on Spain, and that's in a, sort of similar way, analyzing alternative sources on women's work. She was able to come up with an alternative estimate of total employment, or of female employment, and of total employment as a consequence. And that led her to challenge general narratives on the pace of economic growth in Spain, on the structure of the economy during the transformations that happened in the country. And so basically correcting female employment led the scholar to challenge received notions of economic growth in this case. The other direction could be inwards, meaning going inside the household in a way. So being able to observe more details about what each family member does and how much they earn and so on could be informative in terms of intra-household inequality, right? So this polarization of gender roles has consequences on the welfare of women themselves, of women and girls. And there is evidence that these mechanisms could be causing material deprivation of women and girls in these kinds of contexts. And if we were able to hopefully incorporate intra-household inequality in the discourse, we would probably find that overall inequality is underestimated if we neglect these distributive mechanisms within the household. So just to conclude with a kind of slogan, this insistence on measurement, even though it's of course very tricky and challenging, is probably essential in order to be able to contribute to challenge and to shift these broader debates, to be in dialogue with these big quantitative narratives. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, I leave the floor to Juliana that will do a bit of a discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much to the speakers who made it here in person, besides inconveniences and personal difficulties. So it will not actually be a discussion because I think your presentations were very self-explanatory. So I'll just open up the floor to questions. So I'll just ask some questions myself. But what I wanted to tell the audience to give some context is how this what was the origin of this session. So the speakers and I, or actually the speakers, I mean, like they decided everything themselves. They were super, they are super on point on this topic. So the idea was to use the lens and of the binomial between paid and unpaid labor to analyze care work, domestic work through time. So we try to use this fil rouge in these three presentations. So Alessandra opened up the discussion by providing us with a framework to reflect upon what she defines the complex genealogy of domestic wages. So this way we learned that the debate around housewife salary did not start in the 70s, but much before, during the fascist period. And Alessandra walked us through the evolution over time, which saw a mixture of different arguments, some progressive ones and some more conservative arguments. And so, in fact, during the fascist period, for instance, the claims for housewife salaries were not close to, were very far from being feminist and much closer to a rationalization of female labor. Well, then Sabrina took us to the 80s and to the 90s and to the debate on commodification first and corporatization afterwards. Well, Julia gave us an empirical application of what we have been said, and her work is an example of an historical work analyzing female employment within a framework of social reproduction. I don't know, you never use the expression, but and and I think it tackles two very important topics that are gender segregation, both in paid and unpaid work. And an important, I mean, I'm an economic historian, so what I find really interesting in Julia's work is the source per se, because it is a source that allows to study productive and reproductive work in a historical framework. And actually a starting point of her work is the literature strand, which reflects upon the alternative measures to measures that are alternatives to female labor force participation to measure female work in the past. So I'll start with a question for Julia. As the aim of this workshop was to start from existing works and to, in order to reflect on what can be done. So my question is, I mean, it's a very broad question, but so studying care and domestic work in historical perspective is obviously very difficult. So besides family monographies, what are other sources that you think are a good fit to embrace this social reproduction perspective in historical context, especially in the case of Italy? And then my other question was actually related to something you said at the very end. So, I mean, like something that you mentioned at the very end, so I'm gonna ask it anyways, but so you talk about intra-household allocation dynamics and how important they are. In the article, you focus about income, but I mean, from what I remember very vaguely from the INEA monographies, there is also information, for instance, on food. I don't know how detailed it is. So I was wondering whether you were planning to analyze this dimension. Some weeks ago, we had Lorena Lombardotti here as a speaker at our seminar, and she talked about social reproduction of food, which I thought was also, I mean, could also be very relevant in this context, and could also like fit other kinds of literature, like the one connected to, allocation of care, gender bias in the allocation of care more in general. So then a question for Alessandra. So I know you have extensively worked on a different form of care work that is the paid work of midwives, so the levatrici for the Italians. And so I was wondering whether using this interpretative framework of paid and unpaid work, you could also, I mean, if you could also like mention how the midwives would fit into this theoretical framework, and it's a bit ambitious. So, and well, my second question has to do with so how the Communist Party in the 70s reacted to the claims of the feminist movement on housewife salaries, because it's something that came up, I mean, not exactly related to housewife salaries, but the issue of the Communist Party reactions during this period came up in the series, often came up in the series of seminar we had in the past months. So I was wondering whether you would tell us a bit more on this. Well, for Sabrina, also have two questions. Again, very broad questions. So let's see what comes up from the discussion. But talking about Italy, you mentioned the transition from, and I quote, a family model of care to a migrant in the family model of care. So I mean, obviously embracing this intersectional dimension is necessary to fulfill what yesterday Rossella defined as relational approach to care. And I guess, I mean, like you worked a lot on this, maybe like you didn't have much time to talk about this in the presentation. So I was just like wondering if you could articulate a bit more on this intersectional dimension. Well, and this is the very last question. Alessandra left us with this, like the book, the manifesto for the housewife salaries in 1975. And well, you started with talking about commodification of care in the 80s. So like there is something that went wrong from the like manifesto in 75 to the 80s. So I was wondering what was, I mean, according to you, what went wrong and what could have been done, what should have been done instead. So I know it's very ambitious, but just some food for thought. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Okay, so before, there were a lot of questions, but before giving the occasion to answer to the speakers, I would like to see if there are questions from the audience. Yes, you have to come here. Otherwise, right, perfect.
So I wanted to thank everyone in the panel for the presentation. They were very, very interesting. I have a question for Sabrina, which is, I wanted to know a bit more about who's employed in the corporatization of care that you just showed us. In particular, I was wondering if the people employed in these corporates that provide care services are carers, or maybe we're working like still in the private sector, but maybe like in a family-based kind of employment. So I'm thinking about like migrant women, which are hired directly from family and are now shifting to a corporate way of working, or if this corporatization is actually opening up new jobs, or if there's just a shift within the labor force. And then I have a question for Julia, because I know that you've also worked on reconstructing the women's force participation throughout history and not just the 30s. So I just wanted to expand on your presentation by asking whether the gap between the official data and the data that you constructed from monography has reduced with the, for example, like structural changes and industrialization. Just because like knowing the production structure of Italy and the great number of family-run corporations, I still expect that the gap is there, but I'm wondering if it's shrinking or not. And then like very hard question, I think, but is it possible to like correct official measures of employment to account for everything that you showed us? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. With Giacomo, then Joe. Thanks a lot for the great session. My question is possibly to Alessandra or to Julia, because it was stimulated by your work and by Alessandra mentioning at some point that feminists did not know, ignored or pretended to ignore the fascist reasoning on these issues. And from also my work on female employment in this period, and Julia's series that actually show, for those who don't know, that fascist Italy is the only period in Italian history in which the Italian female share of employment increased. In that sense, I wonder if feminist scholars of the history of women overlooked fascism more in general, because in many ways to me that I'm mostly ignorant on feminism. So it's a true question. I don't know enough about the feminist work on that, but also this emphasis on unpaid and out of market work in this period in which the model of the Italian economy is on one end to reduce wages, and so female employment is crucial to push for even lower wages. So we observe that actually, again, for those who don't know, agriculture was the only place in which female employment decreased in this period, and it decreased because of wrong numbers. So now we know that basically female employment possibly boomed in this period. Also, children employment increased for the very same reason in this period. At the same time, the politics of autarky and before that of deflation and so on forced women to have a double shift in being more and more effective in processing the food, less and less food to while also working in the market. So in that sense, how exceptional that is in the broader history of women, I think it could be also something to be discussed, or maybe you just have to point me to readings I haven't done yet. So I wondered if you have suggestions on that. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we can take a question from Jerome.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really interesting. I'll try to be brief. So it's to Sabrina first, but I think it also links to Alessandra's point about the wages for housework, which is the state act. It's not wage, for example, a transmission of husband's revenue to the housewives for retribution of the household. And in the sense, the question to Sabrina is the marketisation that we observe and the corporatization in many countries. It's still very much with the state in hand, because there is no market creation and there's no market sustainability without subsidies. Cash subsidy, either through cash subsidies to the families to buy on the market, or cash subsidies, direct subsidies to provider. So is there a sense that the analysis of the marketization is a different one in the case of care, and care in a broader sense, health is the same, and education, compared to more other activities that they wouldn't simply exist without the state intervention, because people are not able to pay for it, so it will still be inside the household. So when you said that we bypass the state by going from the family to the market, actually it's because the state pays for it, also partly pays for it, that this market can develop. So I wonder whether that changed the framework of analysis. And for Julia, briefly, did you get a sense from analyzing these detailed accounts of activities that what constitutes the gap? Is it just a simply accounting procedure, like if the family produces ham, some of which will be eaten at home and some of which will be sold to the market, that obviously it takes less time to have a surplus for oneself. What was the sense of completely ignoring that, or just if you have one example, or because it's such a massive gap that surely part of that is to do with the not different activities, but just how allocate what expensive to be sold and what expensive to be eaten at home.
Okay. We have all right. But no, yes. Please come, Ipek, and then we're trying. No, we have also Betty online that wanted to make a question. We're trying to make her panelist so that she can talk. But yes, but in the meanwhile.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Just to follow up on the questions to Sabrina, the dichotomy, I think it also follows up on what Jerome was asking, the dichotomy between care as unpaid versus commodified, in between social provisioning as another alternative, socialization of care, as opposed to commodification of care, as opposed to keeping care on an unpaid basis. And thinking of, for instance, education services and healthcare services, how in most economies there's a coexistence of social provisioning alongside with private market provisioning, commodification, as you say. So I'm wondering if a similar parallel systems approach, a combined approach, also extending to early childhood care services, long-term care services, disabled care, elderly care services, whether this can be, actually, they can be complementary, where the private sector provisioning is not necessarily demeaning, but rather, sort of improving the innovation and the professionalization of services, particularly considering the fact that in many countries also the social welfare state, the state, the governance of the state services is not necessarily efficient. There are clientelist relations, and the monitoring is not good. So in many instances, actually, such commodification can help with lifting the bar up. And very quickly to Julia, it was very interesting, the comparisons, but I'm presuming that this was in reference to census data, whereas for a long time now, we measure employment through a household labor force surveys. And exactly through critiques like this, the household labor force surveys integrate additional questions to capture those different variations of women's productive work. And therefore, actually, the employment rates are pretty accurate in that sense. Thank you.
Okay, let's have the last question from online, from Francesca Bettini. Dalla regia, se... Let's see.
Thanks for a very interesting session. I really liked it. I have questions for all. I'll try to be brief. One is for both Alessandra and Julia. Either can answer, I guess. And it is the parallel with the study they did on something I read on rural Japan recently, on rural Japan in the 50s, not in the 30s. There was an article published in Japanese Political Economy in 2022, the making and unmaking of housework in Japan. And one of the contention, at least when I refereed the article, I haven't read the final version, was that actually this attempt to rationalize and make housework more efficient, which took place in rural Japan in the 50s rather than in rural Italy in the 30s, proceeded through, for example, time studies and things like that, was a very interesting source. And the claim was that through the actually, the actual attempt to define housework in these studies, people became more aware, people themselves, women and men, partly participating and partly generally cognizant of these studies, became more aware of the burden of housework that was exaggerated for certain members of the family, in particular, in the case of Japan, for the younger wife compared to the mother-in-law. And apparently, these studies led to some rebalancing of housework within the family, partly, very little, vis-a-vis men, but mostly among women. I wanted to know if anything of the kind happened in Italy. Then, hopefully, a shorter question for Sabrina. She rightly mentioned rationalization of time, both with respect to, the latest stage, what she calls corporativization, but also with respect to the public services that public authorities provide. Now, I wonder, do we have really is there something that is an alternative to counting time for care, since care does require time that may otherwise be devoted to other activities we value, meaning maybe extreme rationalization should not be welcome, but do we have an alternative to, as I said, measuring and counting and sort of comparing the time across activities, including care versus other activities? Then a remark for Julia in particular. I very much like her bold attempt to revise estimates of all sorts for Italy. And I think it's a very valuable attempt. So I do encourage, this type of work. I only have a query about actual quantitative estimates, because she estimated something like 80% of all women involved in agricultural work, I guess across Italy, based on a recalibration of this source she is exploring. Now, while I would say that in the north, from the accounts of my grandmother, may even be an underestimate. I wonder what's happening for the south of Italy, because agriculture was mainly far from places where family lived in the south. And as far as my complete anecdotal knowledge goes, men traveled to the fields, women stayed back. So how do you get, if you think about southern and northern Italy, how do you get such high figure as 80% if most of the women in the south stayed at home? It's just a curiosity. Thanks.
Okay, I think we can let you answer all these questions. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Alessandro wants to start. Yeah.
So, thank you very much. So many thought-provoking questions. I'm not sure I will be able to answer to all of them. Anyway, thank you, Julia, for mentioning my studies on midwives. And that's true. I worked on professionalization of midwives quite a lot in my life. And I work a lot on abortion practices. Um, in a point, I mean, in a way, this changed my way to look at behaviors, and it changed my interpretative approach, because it was a way to reflect, to think about what does it mean to care and what does it mean to cure. And these two verbs are full of things inside. They have to do with a lot of things, with money, with affection, with habits. And when I studied midwives in fascist period, and I studied the abortion practices during fascism, I saw how perfect fascist midwives, for example, perfect in the sense that the way they were enrolled in the albo delle levatrici, but they performed abortion in the same time. Why? They in a way thought that that was a way to care about women's health. I think that this it is a great suggestion how to look at things. And maybe in a way I can in the same path answer to Giacomo, and I will give a more general answer. I think that the biggest problem is in the historiography on fascism in general. How poorly it has understood gender, how poorly it decided to use gender on one hand, and how poorly it has decided to use the tools of social history on the other. It means that also historiography had a very old idea what is political history, Nazi bodies, for example. And it decided to follow the models, the new man, no, l'uomo nuovo, and exemplary wife and mother, but what is inside? I think it went lost until now. And then there's something more, the temptation to place fascism in a parenthesis. I think it's still very strong. This is the reason why I wanted to show the Article 37, because I think that in this putting it in a parenthesis, admitting or not to do it, not admitting but still doing it in a way, it means that the longer term concatenation are lost. And I think it's a great loss. It's a big problem. It's still a big problem. I know that it's not an answer to, but I mean, I think it's general answer. And okay, maybe, yeah, maybe I tell something more later.
So thank you for all these very nice questions. Of course, I mean, your questions are just pointing at some of those of the recurrent issues in these debates in historical terms, but also for current debates and that. And I think that with Alessandra, we made a very strong effort to, you know, in 40 minutes to summarize libraries about all of that. So let's try to go on some key points. The question of professionalization. The question of professionalization is a dilemma in the field of care. Let's focus only on basic care provision, because if we expand to education and even health care will be even something different. What I'm talking about is basic care provision. So nanny, taking care of the elders without a particular disease, etc. Cleaning a home, cooking. So professionalization is there since very long time, at the same time in which, as Alessandra described, there were this idea of improving the performance of cleaning tasks, of housekeeping for unpaid workers. I mean, the women in their own households. At the same time, they developed also trainings, professional schools for domestic workers. In Great Britain and in general in colonial countries, these schools were very often organized for women that were sent to the colonies in order to be domestic workers there. So British, Dutch, German women, French women, not so much Germans, going to the colonies. At the same time, I don't know, in Germany, sorry for the lapsus, I wanted to say that in Germany in the 1950s, instead there was the first training school for domestic workers in Germany. In Italy, the larger domestic workers organization called ACLI was organizing professional trainings in the 60s and 70s. And I'm sure you can have all these examples from other European countries. I'm focusing on Europe, IPEC, so this is also part of the story. But I know that similar things happened other places, but I'm not here. So professionalization for me is a dilemma. As I said, of course, it's improving the performance, it's improving the quality. So the big issue here is the quality of the care provision, of even nanny work, etc. At the same time, it's a very exclusionary process. Some people are entering in the process of professionalization. Some people will have better jobs, better paid. Some people will receive better care. Some other people will not. And studies have shown how the more we improve the level of professionalization for a sector of the care market or the care provision more in general, so I'm also including not market-based, but could be public provision of care, the more we improve this professionalization, more people will be outside the system. So let's say that the number of people that will be working without a contract, if to get a contract for doing these jobs, in order to get a contract for doing this job, you need to have a diploma. You will have less people having access to that kind of employment. This is also going back to your question. So the type of and also the other question about the kind of care job. So in this process of corporatization, we see the expansion of highly professionalized care jobs, which are going to be for people with some type of diplomas. For example, in Italy is OS. The portion of people who are able to enter in that specific career path is not enough to satisfy the care needs of the entire population, but is also not able to attract all the offer side, let's say, of the workers. So this is a dilemma, I'm saying. So professionalization is good, can be good. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for everybody in the same ways. Another big dilemma is about, so this also is all connected to what Francesca was asking. Ciao, Francesca, in terms of measurements, organizing better. I mean, these are the same measurements that you spoke about, and also the measurements that the women campaign, the feminists doing surveys among them, saying we spend so much hours in order to provide care. This is what we do. I mean, there is a part of the story that we didn't say today. That was the achievement of a pension for housewife. So this type of reasoning, really counting the hours, is very important part of rights claiming by the side of the movement, by the side of some organizations, but it's also on other people has been enacted on cost reduction. So if you were able to clean these in 30 minutes, why don't you try to clean it in 20 minutes? And if you were good at doing that in 20 minutes, why don't you try to clean it in 10 minutes? So this is actually what has been going on a lot. So cost reduction, maximizations of Europe, in some European countries, the employment of migrants for these jobs is highly forbidden, cannot be done. So migrants working in these jobs, newly arrived migrants, are all undocumented migrants that you can see our professionalization doesn't really count for them. In other countries like Italy, instead, there's been an expansion of employment of migrants for these jobs. And we really can see countries like as Italy are, so the privatization has happened, making families, more and more companies, basically, able to employ migrants in formal or informal ways. And this has been, some people say, a very offer-driven kind of market. So the market has expanded the more the offer of cheap labor in this sector was increasing. So not much a demand-driven expansion, but more like offer. So going to the bowel disease that you as economists know better than I do, et cetera, et cetera. This also explains the expansion of migrants' employment in that. Yeah.
Okay, so many questions. So I'll try to be kind of quick, but also try to cover almost all the topics, hopefully. I'll try to go in order. So first, Juliana's questions about other, expanding this type of approach to possibly other sources that go beyond this particular context and time period. It is tricky, of course. That's the reason why we are still attached to census estimates, just because the alternatives are almost by definition a bit spotty. I guess in general, so monographs are not in wide enough supply to be able to, go over the whole history of Italy and over the whole territory of the country. In general, sources that do not focus on the individual necessarily, but that focus on the family tend to be a bit more useful for the kind of purpose of adjusting female work. So, for example, I'm aware of a paper by Beatrice Zucca-Micheletto that asked the same sort of question, like how wrong is the question of the census, right? For a totally different context, like a pre-unification census in Turin, so an urban setting, and she used poor relief sources. So it's like a completely different thing that is not built for labor force estimates, but because it focuses on the family and because it elicits a different kind of response, then you could leverage it to try to correct. But I guess this will always be sort of a painstaking work of finding ways to to adjust in particular contexts and times. And I think this connects also to the second question that we have. Do we know how big the gap is over time and perhaps across regions? Unfortunately, not yet, because we don't have enough variation in these alternative sources that allow for a correction. So for now, we just have a very crude idea of what might be the underestimation in some periods. Probably I'm just, talking or thinking out loud now, but maybe the most fertile approach would still be Vitali-like approach, where we have possibly a data-based educated guess for an inflation factor that is a bit more specific over time and place. But yeah, I think it would be too much to hope for enough, variation to be able to really perform this kind of comparison consistently, unfortunately. Juliana's question on intra-household allocation and other things that could be mined from the monographs. Yes, definitely. This is something I'm still working on. It's been a long project, but kind of looking more into the allocation of resources within the household, looking more at consumption, and trying to use empirical methods to try to really estimate the share of household resources that go to each household member. So that's a work in progress, but I think I find it interesting. Giacomo, that was, I think, at least if I understood correctly, whether fascism or the interwar period could be considered sort of maybe an overlooked moment of rising female participation against maybe longer structural tendencies, rising female participation in agriculture. Yes, part of it is probably for the wrong numbers of the censuses 31 and 36, but probably there's some truth to it, and I think it's an interesting take. You probably know the works by Silvia Salvatici that in part use the same source, the monographs, and one of her big messages is that this period of crisis in agriculture led more women to join the labor force just because they needed to, and they needed to do that in order to support the family. So that's probably part of what was going on. And a more unstructured thought is this idea that Alessandra was discussing of the fascist period being a very strange mixture of modern ideas and conservative ideas, right? So women being held back, but also maybe brought in. There's a strange contrast there that is interesting to explore. Then the question about why the gap. Yes, sorry, I wasn't very precise about the estimation exactly of this alternative estimation of female labor force participation. This also connects to Francesca's question, why is the gap so big if, for sure, some parts of Italy, didn't really allow for women to work consistently. So the way in which that estimate was obtained was, I count a woman to be employed if she did any market work during the past year. Typically, it's the reference period of the monograph. So that's a bit of a strange definition of labor force participation, but keep in mind that our modern idea of labor force participation, the labor force survey one, is an instantaneous measure of work, or a very short term measure of work. Like, did you work the past 2 weeks? That we cannot do it in the past. Before the existence of labor market surveys, it's kind of hard to apply that same framework. So censuses would do something completely different. So they look at a habitual measure of work. So what do you do usually? What is your profession in general? That's another measure. It's kind of different. And the measure that we can get from the monographs, or one of the measures we can get from the monographs, is, did you do any market work at all? which is another thing, and probably overestimates given seasonality, given the irregularity of market work for women, especially in the South, as Francesca was noticing rightly. So there could be ways to maybe restrict this definition, this very broad definition a little bit, based on seasonality, and try to simulate a more modern labor force survey definition of work, because we know hours worked, we know seasonality a little bit. So yeah, definitely the 80% figure is a high one. And then, yes, again, back to Francesca's question, and then I finish. So the article on Japan in the 50s, thank you for the tip. I think it's really interesting. I was not aware of this. I only know a little bit about this, I guess, Japanese tendency to document really carefully things that happen inside the household, like the kakeibo, like the household budget tradition in Japan. But I didn't know about this study, and regarding the consequences of being observed or the consequences of measuring things that are usually not measured on people's behavior. It's a super interesting angle. Unfortunately, we have no idea about what actually happened in observed families in the 30s once they were forced to provide all of this data on their lives. It would be very interesting to know. But yeah, thank you so much for the tip on the article.
All right. Thank you, everyone. So with these final answers, we close the session of today, of this morning. But today at 4, we have the final roundtable of this today's event, and we will have again Ipek and Federica Aloi, Eleonora Mizzoni, and Francesca Lizzi. So I'll see you again here at 4, and thank you for the discussion and all the questions.